What is the difference between hate speech and speech that you hate? For the last couple of sessions we've had together, we've been talking about the book of Job and the problem of human suffering, and how does justice fit into any of that? Can the question that we just asked, what's the difference between hate speech and speech that you hate, find an illustration in the book of Job? And the answer is yes. In Job chapter 1, Job loses everything he possesses. All of his livestock are killed, including the individuals that are watching over them. They all lose their life except one individual that comes back to give him a message. On top of that, all of his children have been assembled in the home of his eldest son. A storm rages and the dwelling collapses. All of his children are killed. In chapter 2, Job comes down with a very serious malady, an illness that creates extremely painful boils from the sole of his feet to the top of his head. In fact, his own wife said, "Just curse God and die." And he makes a statement when she says that. In chapter 2 and verse number 10, he said, "You speak as one of the foolish women. Shall we receive good from God and not receive evil? Can we anticipate that only good things happen to people that are trying to live in a good way?" And yet it's an idea that has been embraced by his generation. In fact, it's an idea that still exists in many parts of the world today. That if you are having all sorts of prosperous things happen in your life, that God has got to be pleased with your life. And if you have one malady or one calamity after another, it's because you're living in an evil way. Was the mindset then? The mindset now. 3 friends actually travel to where Job resides, and they sit in silence with him for 7 days. They don't know what to say because of the amount of suffering and grief that they see in their friend. Then chapter 3, Job actually denounces the day of his birth and asks the question, "Why didn't I die as soon as I was born? I can't take this." In chapter 4, Eliphaz begins to talk back to Job. And the idea very much is that the righteous are not people that suffer. It's the wicked that suffer. Job responds, and then Bildad, the second friend to talk, raises some similar kind of statements. That's their belief. And again, Job responds. He used to believe that as well, but he can't make heads or tails of it now. It just doesn't make any sense. The question is, what's the difference between hate speech and speech that you hate? In the answer of the friends to Job, and it continues through several cycles of speeches, as it were, their gentle rebuke at the beginning turns into a very belligerent kind of attitude toward Job. The statement is made in chapter 11, Zophar, the third friend, to answer. Here's the way he talks to Job, beginning in verse 2. "Should a multitude of words go unanswered, and a man full of talk be judged right? Should your babble silence men, and when you mock, shall no one shame you? For you say, my doctrine is pure, and I'm clean in God's eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom. For he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves." That's hate speech. What's he saying? Job, you have lost everything that you own. You've lost even every one of your children. They are dead. You've lost your health. And yet with all of that and with your attitude, things need to be more severe against you than they already are. Maybe you just need to die. That's hate speech. Why does that come about? Because what Job is questioning are things that his friends have always assumed. They've always believed these things were correct. Righteous people don't suffer, only evil people do. And when that's called into question, that is speech that they hate. The idea that they could be wrong, they don't want to think that at all. They can be incorrect. Job, you're incorrect. And the fact that you talk about your innocence means you're either lying to us or you have forgotten because you're so horrendously evil that consciously you can't even remember how terrible you are. And so here is Zophar saying, all the suffering that you have, the children, all of your children that you've lost, everything that you possess has been taken away, that's more lenient than what you deserve. It's a hateful way for anybody to talk about somebody else. So within this kind of statement, in verse number 7 and following, Zophar raises some questions. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It's higher than the heaven. What can you do? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. And then in verse number 12, the conclusion of this statement, but a stupid man will get understanding when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. You have a friend that has lost everything and he's sitting there with very excruciating sores from his head to his feet. You tell him that a stupid man will understand when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. Now think about what he's just called Job. Hateful towards this individual that is suffering because they hate the position that Job is taking and the questions he is raising and pointing out that they have assumed things that they have really never proven. And they hate that thought. There's a difference between hate speech and speech that you hate. So the statement is made in the preposition or the proposition of Zophar is you can't find out the deep things of God. It's higher than the heavens itself and you have no knowledge about that. You can't understand that. No human can understand the mind of God, verses 7 through 11 of chapter 11. If that's the case, Zophar, then how can you presume to argue the position of God? Because remember, no human can understand the mind of God. It means you can't understand God either. In the response that Job gives back to this friend that tells him, you really ought to just be dead, Job says in verse number 3 of chapter 12, I have understanding as well as you. I'm not inferior to you. Who does not know such things? In fact, I used to believe that, but I'm questioning it now because this doesn't make any sense. In verse number 4, he says, I am a laughingstock to my friends. I, a just and blameless man, am a laughingstock. He still maintains his innocence. And then he points out in verse number 6, the tents of robbers are at peace, and those who provoke God are secure, who bring their God in their hand. This is what he sees. But what he's now seeing is not what he's previously believed. He does not understand how this can actually take place. Interesting statements. He continues his speech in chapter 13. Verse number 2, what you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty and desire to argue my case with God. It doesn't make any sense to try to argue it with you. And then in verse 6, down to the very beginning of verse 9, here's his argument. Hear now my argument and listen to the pleadings of my lips. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you out? If it is the case of his friends have suggested that nobody can stand righteous in the sight of God, which is a really true statement, then Job says, well, if that's the case, then all of us need to be suffering. If you're talking about me being suffering from all of this because I've been unrighteous, and no one can stand before God as righteous, then you need to be suffering as well. But if no one can know the mind of God, just as Zophar has suggested, then how will you speak for God? Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? You can't. You just said that nobody can know the mind of God. Verse number 12, the conclusion of Job, your maxims, your arguments. Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. You assume what you have to prove, and you have not proven it at all. Verse number 18, Job says, "Behold, I prepared my case. I know that I shall be in the right." Logic and rationality is on his side, not the assumptions that have always held to that are still unproven. Verse 23 asks some questions again. "How many are the iniquities of my sins? Make me know my transgression in my sin." Chapter 14 continues with Job talking at length about all of these problems that he sees. But the statement of Zophar, as much as you are suffering, Job, you deserve to suffer more. That's hate speech. Speech that you hate is something that calls into question things you have assumed, positions you've always taken, things that really you've considered to be truisms, even though they may be totally unproven, but you assume them to be true without proof. And when someone points out the inconsistencies, the irrationalities, the fact that you're not logical at all in what you are believing, you can't stand it, so you want them to be silent. That's the speech that you hate. Don't respond with hate speech. We have too much of that in our world already. And the people that are guilty of that, like Zophar, are guilty of that hate speech because their conclusions are called into question. Their assumptions are laid bare, and it is obvious that they are presuming things that are either illogical, inconsistent, irrational, or just unproven. And they do not want to be called the individual, as Zophar puts it, the individual who is a wild donkey's colt born as a man. Let's start taking a look at situations that are around us and things we've always believed with an investigative heart and mind, looking for the answers, not reaching conclusions and then looking for something that fits the conclusions we have already made. The world has been full of that for generations. The religious world has been full of that for generations. We need to be better than that. Interesting book. Please continue reading the book of Job. You may be amazed at what you find. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.